Action lies at the heart of work and perhaps also the origin of language. The first insights into the origins of language come down to us from Protagoras, who claimed that the four roots of language are commanding, questioning, answering, wishing or requesting. These are activities that are intimately related to the following grammatical moods of language: imperative, interrogative, indicative, conditional, subjunctive. Grammarians claim that the above moods or modes reflect a speaker's view of the ontological character of the event/activity that is being referred to. Actions of various kinds are also a part of the account we are given by Julian Jaynes, who investigated the origins of language in the light of his brain research and familiarity with Greek culture, as well as with the more modern study of physical and social anthropology. His interest extended to the origins of consciousness, and he claimed that primitive man was not conscious in the way that we are. He possessed a relatively complex language which, during times of stress, when questions arose that could not be answered, or difficult to solve problems arose in work contexts, a voice from the right hemisphere of the brain emerged in response to the activity in the left, and provided an answer to the question or a solution to the problem. Jaynes called this the bicameral mind, a brain in which language was located bilaterally in both hemispheres. With the emergence of consciousness ca. 1200 BC, language became centered in the left, and we became left-dominant insofar as language was concerned. Bicameral man, then, was grammatically steered by interrogatives and imperatives when there could be no recourse to the other categories. In situations of stress, for example, the interrogative and indicative moods in combination with each other, when developed to a sufficient degree of complexity, are important to our epistemological concerns. Plato and Aristotle were not, of course, bicameral men but possessed a highly complex critical form of self-consciousness. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, pointed out the importance of man's desire for knowledge, and he also referred to the important distinction between what questions, indicative of facts, and why questions, providing explanatory and justificatory answers. The life of contemplation which Aristotle recommended is largely composed of all of the above grammatical modes. Our ethical concerns are related to the imperatives connected to the good, the account of which provides the necessary context of ethical explanation/justification so important to us. The optative mode is also important in this context because it provides us with answers to what questions relating to what we ought to do, or what ought to occur. These grammatical cases serve also as demonstrations of the categorical difference that exists between is statements expressive of the fact of the matter, the truth of the matter, and ought statements that rely on one's own activity/actions and the activity/actions of others in the process of transforming the hope that something occur into its actualization in reality. It was perhaps partly such grammatical considerations that helped to convince Plato and Aristotle to philosophically distinguish the true metaphysics from the good Nicomachean ethics/politics. This issue arose again during 20th century analytical philosophy, when debates over the logical relations between is and ought statements resulted in objections to attempting to derive ought statements from is statements as well as attempts to reduce ought statements to is statements. Both Aristotle and Kant would align themselves with these objections to naturalistic fallacies as part of their argumentation against positivism and all forms of naturalism and materialism. This categorical distinction, it ought to be pointed out, whilst expressive of the many meanings of being thesis, is not pluralistic in the anti-rational sense embraced by Ricoeur. Rational principles such as the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason prevail over all regions of discourse and are essential elements of our understanding and reason. Ought arguments resulting in specific ought conclusions follow the same logical principles of deduction as arguments cast in indicative modes. Against the background of these considerations, simple technical work clearly situates itself both in the grammatical spheres of the imperative and optative/subjunctive cases. The more complex this work is, the more knowledge will be required to perform it, and this may in turn require, as part of the learning process, theoretical study of facts with the help of science, and their related explanations/justifications. The simpler the form of work, the more conceivable it is that the learning process can occur by imitating and doing alone. Ricoeur appeals to the theory of Janet's, which claims that the first words of man, the finite being, can be characterized as a kind of imperative cry, which detaches itself from action and assists in the initiation phase of activity. This cry, it is argued, emotionally connects the word to the work that awaits. Ricoeur characterizes this linguistic expression as a plan, page 200, once it has become part of what he terms praxis, indicating a Marxist view of both word and work. The spoken word is, in a sense, and an authentic sense, an annex of the enterprises of transforming the human merely by the human agent. This fundamental possibility justifies a Marxist interpretation of culture, in which work is seen as the power which reorganizes the full scope of the human. Page 200. The anti-rationalist tendency of modernism does not of course permit recourse to the rationalist works of Plato, Aristotle, or Kant, and this in turn reduces the alternatives available, but choosing to rest one's case on an unholy alliance of Marxism with Christian theology, as Ricoeur does, is surely problematic. Both Marxism and Christianity mutually shun each other for good reason. The rationalistic response to this unholy alliance would be to see in it just one more attempt to resurrect materialistic, dualistic perspectives that had been demolished twice in the history of philosophy, first by Aristotle and then by Kant. Marxists characterize religion as opium for the masses, who cannot afford to buy real opium, and this was an interesting statement to make by the philosopher who hoped that the mass movements, which he was helping to create, would rise in revolution against their imagined repressors and take control of the means of production, all in the name of praxis which took the form of economic materialism. Jesus may well have stated that it would be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, de Civitate Dei, but the Marxist materialistic societies would have seemed to Jesus to resemble Babylon, de Civitate Tyranna, an earthly work or faithless creation by men possessing lost souls, men who would not fare well when the last day or day of judgment came. This dualistic view of the body and soul and the above tale of two cities would fall into the realm of mythology for both hylomorphic and critical philosophers. A mythology which failed to recognize the role of rationality in our cultures, a role responsible for our just laws and the freedom of our citizens. Embedding logos in such materialistic or dualistic contexts where language is either human praxis or the word of God, fails to understand its relation to consciousness, thought, or truth functional normative rationality. For Kant, man is engaged in a normative project which is directed by the categorical imperative, which in turn has faith in principles that connect one's human work with a free flourishing life. Work, for Kant, is also driven by the hypothetical imperatives that focus on the means to one's ends, rather than on the ends in themselves. This civilization-building work proceeds largely in accordance with conditional judgments such as, if you wish to live comfortably then you ought to find work. In this context causality reigns, and the principles connecting the conditions with what is conditioned are causal. Culture constituting categorical imperatives, on the other hand, focus on the unconditional grounds that possess rational connections to that which they make possible. We can see from this comparison that categorical unconditional judgments differ from hypothetical conditional judgments in a number of ways, but perhaps the major distinguishing feature between the two forms of judgment relates to the faculty of origin for these judgments. Categorical judgments originate in the faculty of reason and employ general logic, whereas hypothetical judgments originate in the faculty of the understanding which employs special logic. The latter, insofar as it employs causal principles, is calculating the most appropriate means to a given end. The former explains and justifies ends, in themselves in terms of reasons and the deductive form of argumentation. Language, according to Freud, was a means of bringing preconscious and unconscious material into the domain of consciousness, which Freud characterized as a vicissitude of instinct. The way in which language is used will partly be determined by grammatical rules which will differ for each of the 5 cases referred to above: imperative, interrogative, indicative, conditional, subjunctive, which in their turn are related to the Protagorean activities of commanding, questioning, answering, wishing or requesting. The use of language in religious activity will of course differ, depending upon whether we are considering the Word of God using imperative and indicative language in the Scriptures, or rather considering the parishioner praying, wishing, requesting, for guidance or salvation. This relation between God and the parishioner is reminiscent of the relation between an authority ruling unconditionally over its subjects, and those subjects which to some extent may be neither free nor autonomous, and may therefore be suffering the effects of an unjust, undemocratic society, in the hope of a better form of existence upon the advent of Judgment Day. If the suffering continues with no end in sight, it is just a matter of time before a reformation or a more serious secular revolution dissolves the tenuous relation between God and the faithful. This, it needs to be pointed out, is not the relation either Aristotle or Kant possessed to their religions. For both these philosophers, God was an idea, an arche or principle, explaining or justifying certain truths and norms. The most interesting use of religious language Ricoeur points to in his work, The Symbolism of Evil, Trans Buchanan E., Boston, Beacon Press, 1963, is the confession made by a guilty consciousness. This is of interest to Ricoeur because it is an utterance of man about himself. The source of the utterance, Ricoeur claims, is the sympathetic imagination. The language involved in this activity is a mix of grammatical cases which express an emotional matrix of suffering, fear, anguish, and the experienced unworthiness because the sacred bond between man and his God has been ruptured. This kind of alienation is a far more complex matter than that which concerns Marx, involving as it does, something more than economic exploitation in the external world but rather the peril of the soul in a sacred sublime form of life. In the confession there is, of course, a possible wish or request to be put on the right path, the path of righteousness. And there are also indicative statements relating to the power of God in such matters. The secular view of prayer struggles to understand the meaning or point of the activity, and this might even place this view at odds with those philosophers who relate to their God as some form of principle. The relation of Aristotle and Kant to their gods would appear to reject worshipping the sacred in any confessional form, but there is nevertheless respect for what Wittgenstein would have called the religious form of life, which he sympathized with. Prayer can of course also be either an expression of suffering, similar to a cry of frustration, or even a reflective voice of consciousness that has the consequence of urging itself toward the good in a life filled with problems. This latter form of prayer might take a philosophically reflective form and calmly, in an interrogative mood, pose questions about the meaning of life and expecting answers from the preconscious system of the mind, thus combining the indicative and interrogative modes of language at the expense of the wishing/requesting mode. Ricoeur maintains that it is the imperative function of language that is the closest to the activity of work. According to him, this function remains aloof from the process of living. He points out that imperatives initiate a specific action which is not aiming at the production of anything, but aims rather at influencing an outcome via the actualization of an intention, thus making the thought involved with the intention true. Ricoeur refuses this last Kantian appeal to truth and knowledge, and prefers to remain in his reflection at the level of influence in relation to the meaning of language. If we are to believe Freya, language is constituted of both sense and reference. Applying this to the imperative form of language suggests that when we understand an imperative, part of that understanding transcends the sense of the words and takes us to their reference. It might be that it is this dimension of reference and truth that differentiates an imperative from the wish/request mode, i.e. the wish/request form may involve removing the natural human authority that Aristotle pointed out in his Ethics is related to the idea of the good. Insofar as these words in imperative form make reference to principles, e.g. promises ought to be kept, they then become self-explanatory or self-justifying. Imperatives of this form thus range over what questions and why questions. There is, as Ricoeur emphasized, no technological or merely causal relation between words of this form and the result produced because, as Anscombe pointed out, an intention is specifically related to the why question and a reason for acting rather than any cause. This form cannot be justified by the principles of the productive sciences, but rather require an appeal to the principles of the theoretical and the practical sciences. The specter of Wittgenstein's essence specifying grammatical definitions arises in the context of this discussion, and we should recall his final justification at the end of the chain of what and why questions, e.g., this is what we do. Wittgenstein's investigations into the uses of language and grammatical justifications are not empirical investigations, but resemble more the kind of investigation we find in the critical philosophy of Kant, which Wittgenstein specifically acknowledged as an appropriate method. There is also an interesting similarity of the Wittgensteinian investigations into the concept of forms of life to Aristotelian hylomorphic investigations into sush. Ricoeur mysteriously claims that it is the optative mode of language which is related to what he terms the fundamental act of evaluation. This view contrasts, of course, with the Kantian claim that it is the imperative category that constitutes evaluation in the ethical sphere of value. Our free lives pose many ethical problems for us, which Kant claims are best resolved by duty-steered imperatives that may constrain those wishes which tempt us to favor our desires over the needs of others. Ricoeur links self-questioning and the interrogative mode with the optative mode, and there is a suggestion of the influence of Heidegger and his definition of Dasein, a being for whom its very being is in question. Ricoeur claims that the question at issue is answered partly in the dialectic of the word of man in the realm of meaning, and partly in the work of man in the larger realm of culture. In his earlier works, Ricoeur defined human existence in terms of the effort to exist and the desire to be. In this essay, Work and the Word, Ricoeur returns to his Marxist analysis of work in terms of alienation and objectification, thus stripping work of its cultural significance. Ricoeur claims that it is the task of philosophy and culture to offset objectification by a reflective questioning process. Page 213. This needs to be done if the discussion is to be lifted above the base level of the economics of work, which is largely a reductive exercise in which the use of money, for example, is regarded as a fetish. Ricoeur praises utilitarianism and technical education, and also the more disinterested role of the university in culture, and concludes his investigation with a banal claim that both word and work are needed for the purposes of civilization. For Kant, as we have noted above, it is the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason, general and special logic, and the categories of the understanding which include the categorical imperative that constitute culture which Kant regarded as a higher form of communal life than civilization. The latter is, in Kant's view, driven by hypothetical imperatives which strive for homeostasis and happiness, which for Kant was the principle of self-love in disguise. The hypothetical imperatives of civilization are of course important for the meeting of our needs for safety and security, but only categorical imperatives and the principles related to them can sufficiently answer the aporetic questions raised in relation to the being of our humanity or explain the inner awe and wonder we feel when we think about the moral law within us. For Aristotle, the attachment to a dogma such as Marxism would constitute a very limited realm of value that concerned itself only with the external world and one's basic desires. The values of the body and the soul, and their intimate relation, is bypassed in Marxist theory where men become mechanical parts in a materialistic system aiming at production. This, on a hylomorphic view, would constitute a very limited conception of the good mentioned in the Nicomachean Ethics. Marxist theory, from the point of view of hylomorphic political theory, appears to have omitted consideration of the most important synthesis of the thesis of oligarchic values and the antithesis of democratic values. Aristotle called this synthesis constitutional politics, and attributed it to the value system of the middle class. A value system embracing the contexts of exploration and explanation/justification that we find in the cultural activities of the theoretical, practical, and productive sciences. Amongst such values we are likely to find the idea of freedom, the idea of justice, and the idea of the importance of knowledge, which for both Aristotle and Kant could be defined in terms of justified true belief. These ideas constitute our culture, which certainly sees the word to be a part of the work of meaning and part of the work of investigating the many meanings of being.